full of people living all around. All these beautiful mansions, they were all family houses and they belonged to the local merchants. But in order for you to understand way better how the revival period works and why it actually happened, let me go with a bit more history. Now, from the end of the 14th century to the end of the 19th century, for 500 years, we were under Ottoman rule. Now, the Ottoman Empire was huge. It was completely different from the Bulgarian Empire by almost any category that you can think of. Bulgarians didn't have any representation in parliament. We were basically subjects to the Sultan and to the decisions of his close politicians and the people close to him. Like Bulgarians, we had no rights to govern our people. We had no rights to be actively involved in the important decisions around our old lands. There was no Bulgarian schools. Schools were Turkish and sometimes Greek. And there were no Bulgarian churches. Churches were Greek because the Ottoman Sultan said that there's going to be only Greek churches because the Greek patriarch was in his capital, Constantinople, and he could be close to him. And thus, for the Bulgarian people, quite tough times started, especially when it comes to preserving our identity. During Ottoman times, some regions of Bulgaria were very liberal, while other regions were totally opposite, very repressed. The liberal regions, you can guess which was one of the most liberal, the region around Plovdiv, since trade would happen around here. Repressed areas, Rhodope Mountains. Earlier I mentioned that farmers very often used to feed armies. So in the Ottoman Empire, the soldiers, the armies had representation in the political life. So the army was given lots of different rights and benefits, and lots of them resided in the mountains, so people there were poor, they were working all day, they were feeding the army, and they were taken advantage of. So again, you see two totally different Bulgarian lifestyles in the Ottoman Empire. But one thing was sure, we were less than 1% of the total population of this country. So it was so easy for us to forget who we are and lose our national identity. And there was no coming back from this. That's why we needed a period of enlightenment. We needed a period of revival that would lead us to a revolution. 1762. That's an important year because a book was written in this year. So important historic periods are started with the ending or the beginning of a war, with an important treaty, with a big discovery, with a cultural event. But no, our revival period was just started with a guy called Paisius, who lived in a monastery in nowadays Greece called Kilendar, who wrote a book called Bulgarian Slavic History. The thing is that Paisi was pretty angry. He was angry with the Bulgarian people who were forgetting their Bulgarian and who were pretending they're Greek or Turkish to get more benefits and more rights. And his infamous first line in the book echoes through history, which is, "Oh, reckless people, why are you ashamed to call yourselves Bulgarian?" And it was a book on history aimed to remind us who we were and where we came from, but it was also a very big rant on how Bulgarians should not forget that they're ultimately Bulgarian. Now, the book was illegal, of course. It was spread all over the Balkan Peninsula. People would rewrite it on hand, and they would spread it to different villages. There is an institution in a Bulgarian village that's basically as a concept not so popular in many European countries, called chitalište. There is no word to translate this. It literally means a reading place. Imagine fundamentally the chitalište being like a library where you cannot take books home. You go there and you read. But it was the social hub of the village. Reading, just like coffee, reading was just the surface reason why people go there. People go to chitalište to meet for the social factor, to talk, to discuss, to gossip, to complain, to have different musical events, to have traditional dances, to preach everything Bulgarian. So the moment every chitalište, the moment more influential Bulgarian families got a copy of this book, Bulgarian culture became trendy once again. And with this, people start forming secret committees. Now, by the beginning of the 19th century, secret committees were established in many important Bulgarian cities around the Balkan Peninsula. In them, influential people would gather up to conspire against the government, to try to figure out ways to steal treasuries, to try to figure out ways to steal some votes to support the revolutionaries that hide in the mountains. No, it's a very romantic kind of a road to independence story. All of that. Now, ultimately, it led to 1878, a little more than 100 years after Boise wrote his book. And in 1870, apologies, 1876, in 1876, secret committees were already ready with the preparations for a revolution. And they had established an elaborate web of connections all around the Bulgarian cities on the Balkan Peninsula, where the idea was for all the Bulgarians in all the cities to have the revolution together at the same time. Because this way, it would be almost impossible for the Ottomans to stop us everywhere. Very elaborate. Only one problem. There was a traitor who decided to betray us and sell all the information to the Ottoman Sultan in exchange for gold, riches, money, houses, everything. A few tours ago, by the way, like 2 weeks, I think, someone asked me what was the name of the trader. I honestly don't know. I've never encountered the name, so I just said probably doesn't deserve for his name to be remembered. But honestly, I have no idea who the guy particularly was. The fact is that the revolutionaries had two options. First, call off the revolution, wait later, and attack out of surprise, regardless of how much time it takes. Second option, still have the revolution. But they decided to have the second option. They said, it might seem very reckless, it might seem even kind of silly from our modern perspective. But they said it's enough of traders, it's enough of us not having an independent country. Let's have a revolution now. We're preparing. They knew they were sacrificing their lives, and they did it. Now, the revolution was subdued in an extremely bloody way. It was a desperate attempt on the side of the Ottoman Empire to still show the rest of the world that they shouldn't be messed with. The truth is, the Ottoman Empire at this time was collapsing, and the rest of the world was just discussing, negotiating how to split the empire after it collapses. So, next year, 1877, all over Western Europe, magazines, newspapers started to write about the oppressed Bulgarian people who still fight on the Ottoman Empire for their independence, much like the Greeks who earned their independence in, 50 years before us. So the revolutionaries wanted to attract the attention of a greater force. It worked, especially when it came to the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire to the north has had a history of fighting against the Ottoman Empire, and these wars were purely economic wars, because the Russians wanted Constantinople. It's that simple. Whoever owns Constantinople owns the Black Sea, and the Russians, they had plenty of territories on the Black Sea, especially northeastern coast. And for all their ships, for all the trade happening, entering the Black Sea, they had to pay tax to the Ottomans, and they didn't want to do it. But now it was the end of the 19th century, it was the turn of the 20th century. People talk about human rights. People discuss how to end all the wars and save human lives. One of the biggest empires of the world couldn't attack one of the other biggest empires of the world because of money, unless they had a moral high ground. And for the Russians, we were an excellent moral high ground. If they were to say that they're coming here to help their Slavic brothers in need, who could really judge them? No one. So, in 1877, a very big Russian army started marching towards the Balkan Peninsula. At the same time, a very big Turkish army started marching from Constantinople to the north. The idea was for the Russians to arrive first and cross the Balkan mountain and fight the Ottomans here around the region of Plovdiv, south of the mountain. Now, if this is, imagine that this is Bulgaria. I know it's difficult, but imagine. The Balkan mountain goes like this in the center of the country. And there is one pass called Shipka in the mountain, which was important for this war. Because this was the pass through which either the Russians were going to go south or the Turkish were going to go north and reunite with the rest of their armies. And whoever first crosses wins the war. So this is where we come. Bulgarians were a small squad, mainly of volunteers, people who got very basic military training, and many of them being, just normal people who didn't fight for their whole lives. They were situated up at Shipka, and their task was very challenging: to keep the Ottomans, the Turkish, for as long as it was necessary for the Russians to arrive. Now, about this fight, about this battle, there are songs, there are poems, there are books, movies. We study about it every year in school, from the first grade to the 12th grade. So we talk about it. It's a probably the most important battle of our modern history. So we won. It was very tough. We had to throw rocks, we had to throw trees, we had to throw the bodies of our dead soldiers just to keep the Ottomans from going upwards. And the Russians arrived. There was the battle. It was won, and then the Russians just went to South Bulgaria, liberated all of it. And in San Stefano, which nowadays is a neighborhood of Istanbul, a treaty was signed the next year, 1878, according to which treaty Bulgaria reappeared on the political map of the world. Now I'm telling you all this because I've been taught that in history there is no what if, but if this battle never happened, we would be having this tour probably in a different country. It could be Turkey, it could be Greece, it could be Russia, who knows? But it's in Bulgaria precisely, or in Lithuania. I mean, you never know how history could go differently. That's an interesting concept, by the way. Don't worry. No one really knows. However, there are some important things I want to mention about this battle. And most important is the tour guide, I'm supposed to give you the objective facts. And nowadays, half of the country praises the Russians as our liberators, and half of the country hates them because they occupied us later on after the end of the Second World War. Now, whether or not the Russians are our liberators, I think I'm going to try and give you the most short and objective answer to this question. First of all, it wasn't only the Russians. Help came from Russia, Ukraine, Finland, and Romania. There were four countries.
And Poland.
And Poland. This I didn't know, by the way, so thanks. And Poland. So help came from 5 different countries, not just Russia. And while the Russian political elite had the Game of Thrones, this I joke because it really was Game of Thrones back in those days, and had so many ideas in their minds about what to do in the course of a war, the Russian armies, soldiers, generals, officers, people who sacrificed their lives on the battlefield were told that they're coming here only to help Bulgaria, not to eventually, potentially, conquer Constantinople. So to the extent that soldiers who sacrificed their lives while the masters stay in their spacious halls came here and helped, yes, to this extent the Russians are our liberators. But you know what really makes me happy? Is we just didn't stand here and wait to be liberated. We actually took part of this conflict and we took a part in a very decisive battle. So we really made sure it would happen. So we could just delegate this whole event to a completely different country. Bulgarians were definitely involved in the liberation, very actively involved in the liberation of Bulgaria. Okay, so I propose enough history. I think this was a very heavy historic stop. If you have any questions on it, I would be glad to answer. If you don't, yes? Yeah. So yeah, the San Stefano Treaty in Istanbul said that Bulgaria is going to be quite bigger than what it nowadays is. But the powers of Western Europe were afraid that a big empire on the Balkans in the modern era is a danger because Russia could easily use it as a satellite country to invade Europe, preach Bolshevism or whatever later on in history. So that's why there was the Berlin Treaty a few months later, signed, which split Bulgaria in two and hence changed the capital. According to the San Stefano Treaty, the temporary capital of Bulgaria was Plovdiv. So the temporary government of Bulgaria for a few months was set in Plovdiv. And according to the Berlin Treaty, when Bulgaria was split and made way smaller, the capital of the very, very, very small Bulgarian country was elected Sofia. And then 1885, 7 years after that, we had a very peaceful unification, which the king basically just recognized and said, okay guys, unified. That's why our motto of the country is united, we stand strong, because something that nowadays we could definitely learn from as a motto. But yeah, since the unification, I think we consider the unification even a bigger, important event than the liberation, even though the national holiday is the liberation of the country. But yeah, so that's it. And then we had the Balkan Wars and the 2 World Wars, which we both lost because of our ambition to regain all of the territories from the neighboring countries of Bulgaria. And that's why many of the neighboring countries of Bulgaria don't really like us nowadays. Because we have a long, long history of fighting against them in the last 100 years, trying to regain control of some territories.
Can I ask,
of course.
is Macedonian language
Now, asking this question in Bulgaria and asking this question in Macedonia, you're going to get to completely different answers. Now, in Bulgaria, I'm going to give you the